Okay, so thanks for this podcast. I'm Dr. Kim Sule. So today we are basically going to be looking at Eminem's lyrics, Cleaning Out My Closet. Now, this is from, I believe, from the album, The Eminem Show. Now, what's interesting is it alludes to a lot of adverse child experiences. And it's a really difficult one because it's a case of whether we take this as being about Eminem or a character that Eminem is talking about, or a mixture of both, really. So I'll leave that to the reader, and I might be interplaying them, really. Now, the other thing to remember is that Eminem has since released another song in 2013 called Heights, where what he raps about in this song about his mother seems to be different. He appreciates that his mother went through hardships, taking care of him. So the hook is cleaning out my closet. And I'm just going to basically take the hook, which says, I'm sorry, mother, I never meant to hurt you. I never meant to make you cry, but tonight I'm cleaning out my closet. And he repeats it again. Now, the question is, what is this about? My interpretation of the lyrics of the hook is that Eminem is bearing what happened to him, or his character is bearing what happened to him in his childhood, and he's aware it will cause pain to his mother, but the reason why he's doing this is he doesn't want to suffer psychologically. So, cleaning out my closet means cleaning out those emotions. Now, this is interesting because we know Freud saw depression as anger turned inwards, often to deep-seated child difficulties or adverse circumstances during childhood. Now, what's interesting is this psychodynamic psychotherapy explanation does seem to make sense, because when you look at things like suicide, when someone is depressed, they can be listless, have no activity. But when you think about suicide, you think about the planning, or even if it's impulsive, and the violence. It does make sense that even though the person is depressed and not motivated, the fact that they could just go out and act out, which is a very violent act. So they see it as anger turned inwards. And in some ways, you could argue that Eminem is basically using the listeners as the psychotherapists. So he's basically cleaning out his closet with us, the listeners, acting as psychotherapists. Now, I don't know if that is too deep, but that's just me. First verse, there's a lot of anger expressed in the first verse. But I want us to look at the second verse, because there's some interesting things inside, you understand? We get a sense of his early childhood. So first of all, we find out about his absent father, and Eminem expresses his anger towards his father. Then he then relates it to hating his partner and trying to make it work for his daughter, for his daughter's sake. Now, if you have to combine those two factors, and Eminem has written about his childhood before, but if this is about Eminem and the adverse circumstances, think about any child experiencing those adverse experiences. So what do we know? We know there's an absent father, there's difficulties with his mother, which he goes on to describe later. And we wonder about whether he's able to form attachment. Now, what is attachment? Attachment is a concept that Bowlby talks about. Basically, with attachment is when we're young, particularly between the ages of 6 months to 2 years, although the times vary in terms of ages, we form an emotional attachment to what is known as a primary caregiver or an attachment figure. And based on the quality of that relationship, we project the quality of that relationship in terms of predicting relationships with others. Therefore, if you have an insecure attachment because you've not had a stable caregiver or there's been a disruptive childhood, this could have an impact in further relationships and cause the risk of developing mental disorders. So that's from a psychological point of view. But what about biological point of view? Becky spoke about epigenetics. So when you have those kind of adverse circumstances, you can talk about how good genes might be switched off due to chemical tags being attached to a particular gene, or bad genes switched on, which increase the risk of things like depression or other mental disorders, because those bad genes have been basically switched on. And now there's been some interesting work about whether these epigenetic changes can be transmitted down to the next generation. And if you look at Yehuda's paper in Biological Psychiatry, it talks about that. But that's enough biological psychiatry, by the way. Verse 3 basically talks about going from living in public housing, again, which alludes to early childhood adverse experiences. But there's also, he basically mentions that his mother was addicted to prescription pills. Now this is interesting because Eminem actually talks about being addicted to opioids. For example, if I remember, he was addicted to hydromorphone and was addicted to methadone. And again, can we see this as environmental factors? So he saw his mother doing it, therefore he did it. So a form of modeling, or do we see it more in terms of genetic factors? But he also accuses his mother of doing what is known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy. And basically, this is an interesting concept. And the concept with Munchausen syndrome by proxy is that a parent, it could be a parent or a relative, taking care of someone else, fabricates illness in the child. And the reason why the parent or relative or elder person does that to the child is because they want a commendation from other, maybe doctors or whatever, of how much they care. And it can be around insecurities in their own life. So Eminem makes the accusation there. But all throughout the verses, Eminem talks about how he wants to make things work. So it's important to realize we are not just products of our genes or our environments. Eminem talks about how he's working out not to get the same dynamic with his daughter or his partner, and how he's restraining himself from getting angry. So what we know is that when people are subject to such environments, sometimes deliberately choosing a protective environment can be helpful. Eminem has chosen to rap about it, and you could argue rapping is his therapy to get his story out and to ensure, if we're looking from the psychotherapy, psychodynamic model, of making sure that the emotions don't eat him up. So thank you very much.